Welcome and good afternoon to commissioners, commission staff, witnesses, and the public watching and listening. I am Commissioner Chair Cantu. The briefing will come to order. This is the briefing of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights implications of disaster relief, Hurricane Harvey in Texas. It is 12:02 on October 21, and the year is 2021. Commissioners are virtually present at this briefing. In addition to me, are Commissioner Adams, Commissioner Adegbile, Commissioner Gilchrist, Commissioner Harriet, Commissioner Kursanau, Commissioner Cladney, and Commissioner Yaki. A quorum of the commission is present. I note for the record that the staff director and the court reporter are present, and 2 Spanish language interpreters are on the line as well. I wish to welcome everyone to our briefing, Civil Rights Implications of Disaster Relief, Hurricane Harvey in Texas. This briefing assists the commission in 3 purposes: review the Federal Emergency Management Agency and its role in disaster preparedness and response. 2, evaluate efforts by FEMA to comply with the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Act, along with other federal civil rights and policies. And 3, compare the response of FEMA to significant hurricane systems, including but not limited to Hurricanes Harvey and Maria. Today's briefing will focus on the civil rights implications of the federal response and impact of Hurricane Harvey in Texas by receiving testimony from subject matter experts, such as government officials, academics, advocates, and impacted persons. Before we begin our briefing, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. I share deep thanks to the commission staff who researched and brought today's briefing into being, including the expert team who works on the logistics, for which this virtual environment presents a whole host of additional challenges. And I thank Staff Director Mauro Morales for his leadership. During the course of this testimony and question and answer period, I caution all speakers, including our commissioners, to refrain from speaking over each other for the ease of the transcription. Additionally, I will need to cue our staff behind the scenes for the appropriate video and audio support. So please wait to speak until I have called on you. Panelists, you each have 7 minutes to speak. Please note, to ensure that we have sufficient time for our discussion this morning, I will enforce the 7-minute time limit. Please monitor your time so you do not risk my cutting you off in mid-sentence. I will strictly inform the time allotments given to each panelist to present his or her statement. And unless we did not receive a testimony until today, you may assume that we have read your testimony statements. So you don't need to use time to read them to us as part of your opening remarks. After the panel presentation, commissioners will have the opportunity to ask questions within the allotted period of time, and I will recognize commissioners who wish to speak. I ask my fellow commissioners to do our part and keep our Q&A concise. Please be brief. Today's briefing features 11 distinguished speakers who will provide us with a diverse array of viewpoints. Panel 1 will consist of speakers who will discuss the role and responsibilities in the execution of federal aid in response to natural disasters. Panel 2 will consist of advocacy, nonprofit relief groups, and academics who will discuss the impact of the federal government response on the impacted communities. With those bits of housekeeping out of the way, we're now going to proceed to the briefing. I turn now to Commissioner Adegbile for opening remarks. Commissioner, please proceed.
Morning, and thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for participating today in our commission virtual briefing on the civil rights implications of Hurricane Harvey. We originally envisioned being present with you in Texas and being on the ground in the way that the Civil Rights Commission through history has traveled around the country to examine the civil rights implications of issues where they exist. Of course, we're in a pandemic, and it has caused us to recalibrate in many ways. And so this briefing, like many of our briefings over the last several months, takes place virtually. And we thank you for your patience and accommodation. It was our hope that had we been on the ground, we would also be able to hear from impacted persons and have a public comment session. But alas, our need to recalibrate it this way has caused us to alter our plan. I want to thank our Texas State Advisory Committee for its work in conducting a series of briefings on the government response to hurricane disasters in Texas, and for issuing what we call an advisory memo on this topic this past May. It has helped to inform our work, and our state advisory committees make a vital contribution to the work of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. It is unfortunate, however, that representatives from the state and local government, as well as the SBA, declined the invitation to participate in this briefing, but I hope they will come forward and provide comments or written testimony. We encourage everyone impacted by the hurricane who has an experience or story or information that they wish to share as part of the commission's work to send their written comments for consideration as part of our analysis, and that those remarks can be sent to harveybriefing@usccr.gov no later than November 22nd. With this, I would finally like to thank Commissioner Michael Yockey, who had the genesis of this idea, as I recall it, and was the first person to suggest that the commission undertake this examination. With that, I thank you and very much look forward to your testimony.
Commissioner Yockey, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And thank you, Commissioner Degbele, for your remarks. I guess I'm sort of the one person who can say that I've actually lived through a natural disaster. Behind me is a background of the Golden Gate Bridge, and some 30-odd years ago, our region was shaken by the Loma Prieta earthquake. But it didn't really end there, and that's really why I wanted to take a look at what happened here, because as much as the disaster immediate response is important, the recovery is even more so. How we build back communities, how we put people back in homes, how do we make sure that we try to make them whole. That is really the important mission of what the federal government does when it allocates disaster relief funds. Unfortunately, the reality on the ground is often a lot different. And the genesis of this actually came because of the disparity that I saw between the response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which we will be going to later this year, and Hurricane Maria. But then, of course, as we delve Hurricane Harvey, as we delve further down, we find many of the same disparities that we saw at the macro level between the two regions, at the micro level inside of the devastated area of Hurricane Harvey itself. And that's what we really want to focus on today. And so I hope for the people who are going to be here speaking today, I have read all your remarks. I appreciate them. They're all powerful. And I really want you to focus for the purposes of this, for me, for the purpose of this hearing, on the issues that we're here to discuss, which is whether or not people, because of their skin color, because of their socioeconomic status, are treated as second-class citizens in the federal relief efforts following a disaster such as this. That, to me, is what I'm concerned about. That's why I asked, and we, this commission together, joined together to put this hearing and this project together. But it's really going to be up to you providing information on the ground to do it. I dealt with that when I was a chief of staff or member of Congress. I actually ended up handling most of the relief efforts, directing them, because I did not see them going where they needed to go. You people are doing the same thing, did the same thing, and we want to hear from you. And I thank all of you for your hard work and for your efforts, and we look forward to your testimony today. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Yockey. Let me now introduce our panelists. This morning, we're going to be hearing first from Francisco Sanchez, President, Emergency Management Association of Texas. Our second speaker is Dr. Tricia Wachtendorf, Director of the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. Our third speaker, Brittany Gomez, Attorney and Counselor at Law, Equal Justice Works, Texas Rio Grande Valley Legal Aid. Our fourth speaker, I added Valley, sorry, Rio Grande Legal Aid. Our fourth speaker is John Beard Jr., founder and CEO, Port Arthur Community Action Network. Our fifth and final speaker for panel one is Veronica Chapa Gorczynski, President, East End District. Mr. Sanchez, would you please proceed?
Sure. Madam Chairwoman Cantu, thank you so much for the invitation. I will tell you, I appreciate the weather vane and the background. As an emergency manager, I appreciate technology, but a weather vane is resilient. It doesn't require power. It's accurate, and the information is in real time. so I appreciate that statement in the background. And especially what you're doing here in terms of looking at Hurricane Harvey. It was for us a transformative event for millions of residents in Houston, Harris County, and the entire state of Texas. As a president of the Emergency Management Association of Texas, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of colleagues, be they first responders, emergency managers, or partners, either both in the public and private sectors, including nonprofit. So the perspective here, it is accumulation of those insights. And it's timely and it's compelling. When it comes to FEMA and other federal agencies involved in disaster response and recovery, I do want to applaud the echo support for the deep dive they're taking into looking at the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's overdue, and we can't do enough quick enough to catch up to where we need to be. So at the federal level, there's a lot of folks taking a look at that seriously, and so I appreciate that. To set the groundwork, Harvey was a storm of superlatives, 27 trillion gallons of rain. Rainfall amounts anywhere from 25 to 51 inches, and a third of Houston was underwater. It lowered the Earth's crust by an inch in less than a week. Second to Katrina, the most costliest storm on record with $125 billion in damage, almost 35 residents in shelters across the state taken out of their home and having to go to shelters, and a tragic 82 deaths. For Harris County, let me set the tone for what Harris County is. For those of you not from Texas or on the commission not familiar with us, it's the third most populous county in the country, 1,777 square miles. One of the most diverse in the nation. And we've got 34 cities, including the city of Houston, which is the nation's fourth largest city. If you take unincorporated Harris County, that would be the fifth largest city in the country. So a very urban area that's unique. Here we had to do more than 120,000 rescues, 1.3 million impacted individuals. That's about 75,000 households, nearly 20,000 residents in shelters, 125 million damage to county assets, and almost $1 billion in total losses. If you want to look at folks, it's almost 500,000, 450,000 folks in our community had to apply for FEMA assistance. We saw for the first time, not for the first time, but in stark relief, was the impact of this disaster on our most vulnerable and least prepared populations. Disparity in recovery rates for those who have flood insurance and the have-nots. Harris County, in response to that and its implications of Harvey, formed the long-term recovery committee that sought to be innovative, bringing together government, private, nonprofit partners together to do the most we could with the scarce number of resources. Out of that, we've had some best practices. We've assisted more than 1 million individuals together, 75,000 households roughly with non-FEMA aid of local dollars raised between government, nonprofits, and our philanthropic partners. But I appreciate this is happening several years later because, as the Commissioner Yaki mentioned, recovery takes time. A 2020 survey by the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston says that close to 20% of respondents were still displaced by Harvey, even this far along. And we have to stop looking at traditional metrics like what defines federal poverty. The United Way has a metric called ALICE, asset limited, income constrained, and employed. They're working, but they're still barely surviving. In Harris County, the ALICE figure is 48% with limited aid to insurance programs because of where they are on the poverty level. And if you look at how programs can help, you can have up to $35,000 in assistance from FEMA for home repair. Even if you were to have that number, it forces many to remain in substandard housing. But that said, $35,000 is the maximum. I can tell you there's a disparity. If you have flood insurance, the average payout was more than $100,000 for Harvey. If you had a FEMA assistance, individual assistance, the average payout was $6,000 or so. It's a huge disparity. In terms of, again, I want to be supportive and applaud the effort to take a look at these issues, but we need to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in a very robust, determined, and genuine way if we want to make changes to the recovery, which is the most essential element in the recovery, in the emergency management cycle. I think we need to look at our federal programs, should look at assistance programs that benefit renters. Historically, the underserved, marginalized, and those affected by long-term poverty, inequality, and climate change are less likely to be homeowners. Single mothers fit that category. And look at the pandemic impacted Black, Hispanic, and low-income neighborhoods to a greater degree. And that comes on the heel of Harvey, other storms, and now the pandemic. I think there should be transparency to the process. Consistent feedback from residents across the board is it's cumbersome, it's confusing, and it can be intimidating. I've been fortunate that I haven't had to seek FEMA assistance when I've been impacted, but I've gone through and gone through that process to see what it's like, and it's challenging. A single aid portal would be helpful. Publish a rubric for approval, and there's some things that are intimidating for folks in these vulnerable communities. The information, it says on the website, can be shared, even though they don't do it. The website says they can be shared with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It can freeze someone's interest in seeking recovery. SBA, $150 million, 15% of post-Harvey aid. Those can assist renters, it can assist small business, those folks like NWBEs. I think it's an underutilized program that could benefit from some outreach in our communities. Disparities in how the cost to benefit ratios in terms of how you do things like national flood insurance and mitigation projects. The cost to benefit ratio being like roughly 1 to 10 leads to investing in neighborhoods that have sufficient and well-priced housing. That leaves communities that are along bayous and susceptible to flooding that are low income because they will never meet that criteria of a 1 to 10 benefit ratio. You have homes in impoverished communities that will be impacted over and over. The use of technology, we started doing that a lot during COVID, but we need to recognize that older residents, the disabled, less tech savvy that are in these communities still need in-person on-site assistance. Before I close, I'll get on my soapbox really quickly on 3 items. And that one is timing. Some programs are quick to get on the ground, but sometimes it can take months or years before some of those federal resources make it to the ground level, like mental health, case management, housing repair. That further puts vulnerable communities in situations where they linger and languish before help gets on the ground. And we raise those local dollars that we want to meet unmet needs that are not covered by our federal partners. We then have to spend that money on basic needs and the kind of assistance that is eventually funded by a federal government. So the quicker the dollars get here, the more can be invested and the more we can raise those local dollars to meet needs and make that effort go further. And I will close by saying that our heroes are the case managers. I know emergency management gets a lot of the credit, but case managers are here for the long haul. There are still emergency managers working on Harvey cases, and they bear the brunt of this. You've got folks, it is their best friend if you have to reach out to them. Several months later, you hit bureaucratic hurdles and they become frustrated, and it takes years before they close those cases, but they are our frontline workers, and I'll be reaching out to our nonprofit partners and case managers to submit some testimony for you so you can hear what's happening on the ground and the kind of stories they're hearing from folks that are impacted by disasters. And so thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm sorry, hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. The 7-minute sign went up. That was for the next speaker, Mr. Sanchez.
So, sorry.
But I really do appreciate your comments. Let's now hear from Dr. Wachtendorf.
I'd like to thank the United States Civil Rights Commission for the opportunity to share testimony with you today. I am a professor of sociology at the University of Delaware, where I direct the Disaster Research Center. Our center has been examining the social aspects of disasters since 1963. This has been the focus of my own work for the past 25 years. Although today's briefing is on Hurricane Harvey, the Commission asked me here today in particular to speak to what we know about vulnerabilities to and inequities during disasters. And let me say this, we know a great deal. Many of the lessons have been long learned, yet those vulnerabilities persist. Our failure to adequately address them contributed to many of the problems that have been noted in previous testimony to the Commission. I would like to highlight 2 themes here today. First, without addressing routine vulnerabilities, Inequities in response are inevitable. Second, failure to adequately address the process of recovery leads to desperate outcomes in disasters. Let us begin before disaster strikes. Well established over a half century of scholarship is that disasters exacerbate pre-existing circumstances. It should come as no surprise that a community that cannot deal with routine rush hour traffic will experience challenges evacuating its residents, nor should we be surprised when routine services that do not adequately address the needs of those living with varying abilities fall short when those services are significantly stressed. Others' testimony is correct to point out to specific problems that emerged during Hurricane Harvey, but let me be clear, we continue to not take seriously enough the fact that mitigating routine vulnerabilities would serve to mitigate the disparities communities experience from disasters like Harvey. For example, stormwater systems are meant to mitigate the impact of flooding, yet the condition and capacity of those systems are insufficient in less advantaged areas. And as planner Marcus Hendricks notes, racial neighborhood composition is a strong predictor of the stormwater infrastructure available. It is then no surprise when systematic research by other scholars found that flooding from Harvey was greater in areas with a higher proportion of non-Hispanic, Black, and socioeconomically deprived residents. It's a pretty straightforward line between disparities in attention to stormwater infrastructure and disparities in hurricane flooding. This is not only a problem in the city of Houston or the state of Texas, it is a critical infrastructure issue setting the stage across the country for flooding disparities, including those in my own state who see repetitive flooding even after moderate rainfalls. As another example, those protected by civil rights regulations must be prioritized in the planning process. Problems are often a result of the exclusion of the disability community from this process, relegating their perspectives to strictly health and medical functions, rather than seeing it as integral to functions such as communications or transportation. At other times, simply doing something can be used as a justification that steps have been taken, even if it does not fully or appropriately address the problem. In my own work, I found that while some shelters may have the needed accommodations for people with disabilities, the services inside may be unknown or inaccessible to the people for whom they are meant to help. Issues related to communication with and to people with disabilities during Hurricane Harvey point to similar problems. In her examination of emergency planning for people with disabilities in California, Jennifer Lazo found that organizations expected that others would begin the process of changing how plans were created, and that others would take action while they waited to follow. Active, purposeful movement towards change is necessary, and necessary by the whole community of organizations before disaster strikes. Allow me to address a second important issue. Failure to adequately address the process of recovery leads to desperate outcomes. Considerable work has been done in the area, including disparities in issuing buyouts, access to flood insurance and grants, and the ability to repay assistance loans. For years, I've heard from disaster survivors of the challenges associated with post-disaster recovery processes. In many ways, it's been clear that unless there's been a serious injury or loss of life in the family, the recovery process can be considerably more stressful than the disaster impact period. Research by Greer and Traynor and their work on Hurricane Sandy supports this. Survivors highlighted the amount of complex paperwork associated with the aid process, unfavorable interactions with government employees, and a sense that the rules were constantly changing. Hurricane Harvey was 5 years after Sandy, and the stories repeat themselves. Checkpoints with deadlines. One can't get a contractor. One doesn't have the original of a particular document. It takes time, deadlines pass, a file didn't upload, processes change, and the person seeking assistance needs to start again. Take this widespread and significant challenge and compound it with the vulnerabilities of particular segments of our community. Perhaps it's a lack of accessibility for those with a disability, or when document or technology literacy is required to apply for assistance, those without competencies can be disproportionately left out. Those without access to technologies or unlimited data plans that support their access are further disadvantaged. For many of us experiencing challenges during a disaster, we remember who we last encountered. In the case of the recovery process, this may be FEMA, even when the problems in recovery processes are across multiple agencies. In the case of the response process, it may be a particular responder who's unable to address a need in the line of defense. This is not to say that there are not times when officials violate rights of disaster survivors. Certainly, the Commission must attend to those isolated acts, both intended and unintended discrimination. But this cannot be our only focus. It is not an either-or issue. Doing so can deflect responsibility onto emergency management and away from the long-term investment that sets the stage for inequities and violations of civil rights protections, even those that are unintended. I would like to conclude by calling on the Commission to consider how the problems noted throughout a particular disaster life cycle are rooted in pre-event conditions that serve as precursors to the disaster itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wachtendorf. I really appreciate your comments. Our next speaker is Ms. Gomez. Ms. Gomez, we'll hear from you now.
Thank you to the Commission for inviting me to talk to you today. I work for Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which is the nation's second largest legal aid provider and the largest in Texas. 16 counties in TRLA service area were included in the disaster declaration for Hurricane Harvey. Thousands of low-income Texans lack access to civil legal representation, and the effects of climate change and natural disasters will continue to negatively impact access to legal assistance across the country, but specifically in Texas, which is considered the most disaster-prone state in the U.S. At TRLA, we represent a resilient client population who are made vulnerable often by the actions of governments and lawmakers. This is no doubt the case of those survivors who were and continue to be impacted by legal issues caused by Hurricane Harvey and the inequitable distribution of disaster assistance funds and funded and administered by the federal government and the state of Texas. From August 2017 to July 2019, approximately 2,900 Hurricane Harvey survivors applied for legal assistance with TRLA. Their legal issues included general civil legal matters, as well as FEMA and SBA applications and appeals, and title clearing for the Texas General Land Office's Homeowners Assistance Program, or HAP. 4 years after Hurricane Harvey, we still represent survivors seeking access to financial disaster assistance funds from the state of Texas's HAP program. Addressing accessibility issues for disaster survivors, more than half of the Hurricane Harvey survivors who applied for legal assistance with TRLA were elderly, and nearly 1/3 identified as having a disability, all of them living on fixed incomes. Many of our clients struggled with technology, internet access, and live in rural areas where there was no public transportation. For example, a disaster survivor in Sinton, Texas would need to drive approximately 1 hour round trip to access a disaster recovery center in either Corpus Christi, Aransas Pass, or Rockport, Texas. This often left them to relying on others to drive them or without access to FEMA and other disaster agencies at all. The Stafford Act requires FEMA to establish eligibility criteria for the Individuals and Households Program, or IHP. FEMA is required to include provisions for ensuring that the processing of applications and other relief and assistance activities shall be accomplished in an equitable and impartial manner without discrimination. FEMA shall prescribe rules and regulations, including criteria, standards, and procedures for determining eligibility for assistance, and FEMA shall issue rules which provide for the fair and impartial consideration of IHP appeals. Yet, in the regular course of operation, FEMA consistently relies on the use of unpublished rules in its administration of the Individual and Households Program. FEMA has stated its published policies, the Individual Assistance Program and Policy Guide, does not actually have the force or effect of law. FEMA's published rules are so vague that hundreds of employees and inspectors who apply those rules fail to do so consistently, resulting in the inequitable distribution of critical funds to disaster survivors. FEMA also uses unpublished rules to instruct inspectors who are not required to have any prior construction experience or knowledge on how to determine whether damage observed after a disaster was actually caused by the disaster. FEMA considers inspectors to be fact finders, not eligibility determiners. But in reality, inspectors make eligibility determinations based on the damages they choose to catalog during an inspection. Because there is no published standard of what is categorized as disaster-caused damage, inspections are highly subjective and vulnerable to implicit bias. This was true after Hurricane Harvey, and it remains true today. When a disaster survivor is denied assistance, the language on a FEMA denial letter is so ambiguous that no one can effectively appeal the decision without knowing what standard FEMA used to issue those decisions. One of FEMA's standard denial letters is the Home Safe to Occupy letter, which states FEMA has determined you are not eligible for housing assistance because the damage caused by the disaster did not make your home unsafe to live in. This letter does not include any facts about what the inspector viewed or deemed to be disaster-caused damage and leaves applicants guessing as to why they were ineligible for housing assistance in the first place. It was also our experience after Hurricane Harvey that appeals with similar facts and supporting documentation would yield different types of assistance or lack of assistance. This can likely be attributed to FEMA's reliance on surge capacity hiring, lack of uniform training, failure to implement effective quality control measures, and lack of transparent standards. In Texas, the disaster recovery structure is bifurcated, with FEMA administering the Housing Assistance Program and the state, through Texas Health and Human Services, administering the Other Needs Assistance Program, or ONA. Though you would be hard-pressed to find a disaster survivor after Hurricane Harvey who understood the difference. Survivors often thought the ONA program was administered by FEMA and not the state. This is likely due to ONA determinations being written on FEMA letterhead and ONA appeals being submitted to FEMA and then forwarded to the state. FEMA's employees would often tell survivors that they don't provide assistance for ONA, leading survivors to believe that ONA assistance was actually not available to them. One benefit of the ONA program being administered by the state is that survivors are afforded additional levels of appeal to include a telephonic fair hearing under the Texas Administrative Code. This puts the burden back on the state to prove that they have complied with their policies and procedures. In our experience, HHSC has had difficulty proving this compliance with policies and procedures because the policies and procedures were actually written by FEMA. Additionally, HHSC was tasked with proving that FEMA inspectors complied with FEMA policies and procedures, which they often could not do. Requesting a fair hearing is arduous and traumatizing for a disaster survivor, but if FEMA employees and inspectors were properly trained and more effective quality control measures were implemented, fair hearings would be the exception, not the standard. Shifting focus to barriers and inequities that exist for low-income renters in long-term recovery, the state of Texas and its allocation of CDBGDR funds excludes renters entirely. The funding that was allocated in lieu of financial assistance to renters was provided to landlords and developers instead. Renters are already at a disadvantage when recovering after a disaster in comparison to homeowners, as rental units are destroyed and it may take years for those properties to be rebuilt. Often renters must leave their communities and relocate elsewhere, and the brunt of the cost is shouldered by them. One may be inclined to believe that renters incur less damage than homeowners because they do not own the property they reside in, but that belief would be misinformed. Affordable housing options that are available decreased after Hurricane Harvey, and this resulted in renters having to confront a higher cost of living, additional security deposits, and other initial costs that are often prohibitive. Further, renters will continue to incur additional damages over time as rental properties are rebuilt. They will likely not be affordable, and even though built with funding intended to address damage from Hurricane Harvey, there will be no preference for renters impacted by Hurricane Harvey. In the 16 counties of TRLA service area, renters were more likely to be Black or Hispanic without adequate insurance coverage and have a difficult time navigating FEMA and the state of Texas's disaster assistance program. Even though renters are more often Black and Hispanic, more likely to be low income, and more likely to lack recovery funds from other sources, the state of Texas still did not provide specific CDBGDR funding to them, but instead created rental assistance programs for homeowners who are more likely to be white, non-Hispanic, and who are temporarily displaced while the state rebuilds or repairs their homes. Thank you again to the Commission for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Gomez. Ms. Gorczynski, we will now hear from you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Veronica Chapa Gorczynski, and I am president of the East End District. So I have the honor of sitting and presenting my testimony this morning to you from the heart of Second Ward here in Houston. I am a community development professional with over 16 years of experience in community development, managing programs for the city of Houston and the state of Texas, HUD entitlement programs, and CDBG disaster recovery program design. Of note, my district that I represent now, the Business Improvement District, the East End District, did not participate in any FEMA or HUD programs after Hurricane Harvey. So I've limited my testimony today to my personal and community experiences with regards to the federal response. I want to thank my colleague Francisco. It's always so wonderful to see you. And thank you for giving the level set on just how beautiful and big this community is. I like to tease people that Harris County is the size of the state of Rhode Island, with or without water. So if you think of that in an event of this magnitude, and the community that I serve, the East End District is 16 square miles, a population of about 75,000. 40% of the people are approximately identify as Hispanic on the last census, and a third speak a language at home other than English. So when preparing for this presentation, I'm so grateful for the staff. Y'all have a wonderful staff on the commission. And they said, why don't you share your personal Harvey story? And admittedly, I was embarrassed too, because my experience was not as bad as others. So when I think of Hurricane Harvey, I think of my colleague, Dan, and his story of getting his wife and a 6-month-old son on a kayak to get them out of their home that was flooding on the first floor. I would think of my friend Lauren, who shared her harrowing experience and actually published an article of trying to hold a weeks-old baby girl above her head as she waded in chest-deep water to cross the street to seek shelter at his neighbor's house that was on higher ground. I also, with you, remember the images that were broadcasted nationally, the families that were devastated in the region. You know, at the end of the day, my husband and I had a roof leak in the ceiling of our nursery. We had a 5-week-old baby. So my husband emptied the nursery and I tarped over the carpet and put any bucket, pot, receptacle I could find to catch rainwater for the following week. The repairs took months. Contractors and the process just took a long time, but we got them done. We didn't ask for assistance because we were humbled by the little impact and the fact that our townhome was intact. I was also really grateful that my son was able to sleep through most of the storm. So like many in Houston, our family had planned to hunker down. And this is a key part of my testimony I want to share, because the first goal of any sort of disaster is we just have to make it. So for us, that meant making sure the gas tanks were full in both vehicles, that we filled up a bathtub, that we had enough groceries for a week. Did we have enough bottles, formula, distilled water? If the power went out, how were we going to cook? Did we have flashlights? Did we have a plan for everybody so we knew where we could go? And most importantly, my husband and I had to have a conversation about at what point we would leave our home. And so after talking about it, we decided that the risk of flooding in our townhome was relatively low. And frankly, we could stay if the first floor flooded if we could keep sanitary conditions on the second or third floor. So again, the key summation of this part of the testimony is, especially with low-income families or residents in a neighborhood, there's a lot of expense that happens just to get to the storm. And then we have FEMA and HUD come and take the rest. So with high water in the East End, I got to tour it the Monday after the hurricane, and the water had receded in a lot of areas. We have 2 bayous, and as the water goes up, it goes down. We're on historically high ground. But as I got closer to the bayous in some of the older Hispanic neighborhoods, you could see that the homes were clearly devastated. There was old blue tarps placed on roofs, and I'm emphasizing old because they probably were there from a previous storm event. There were homes that gave me the most worry, had makeshift wheel ramps. They had possessions piled high on the porch. You could see that clearly all sorts of things from blankets to towels were wet. And the piece that gave me the most pause about it is, that these were disabled and seniors that were left on their own to find their own solutions. So while we had set up at the city of Houston, the George R. Brown became the central for barbecue. We were going to feed victims, first responders, survivors, everybody alike. It was centralized in that part of the area. We still had food chain disruption in other parts of the city. So specifically with the East End, I went and spoke to a grocery store manager. He had driven 2 hours to get to the store to open it up. There was debris on the road and the traffic was bad because we were fighting with first responders to just as essential workers get to work. With tears in his eyes, the man told me that he did not have any fresh food. He did not have any fresh produce, fresh meat. They didn't know when the trucks were coming through. This was 5 days after the storm. So when we're talking about our communities, and especially Houston, one piece that I want to point out is that the Kinder Institute at Rice University actually did a calculation. They do this amazing annual survey. And the survey was alarming because they calculated based on responses that nearly 4 in 10 Houston residents could not afford a $400 emergency expense. So think through the description of what you had to hunker down. In addition to low-income families had lost several days of wages, vehicles were helping other family members that were equally devastated. And due to the timing of Harvey, rent was due in a couple of days. So this is just an abstract of my longer testimony. I went beyond the 7 minutes. I did provide a framework because I've done this for so many years. And the 3 things that I would leave you with are reframe the delivery framework, the framework of poverty. The people who need the most long-term support had the most or the least amount of resources, like Dr. Tricia had mentioned, and they need to recover both from an event and from trauma. Second, we need to strive for a housing first model. As Ms. Gomez stated, we have people trying to bounce around and get assistance, whether they're renters, apartments, trailers, all of these things have costs and they're not long-term solutions. Third, given the magnitude of more billion-dollar storms happening, we need more partners who work directly with FEMA and HUD. You know, at the end of the day, we all participated, or unfortunately were survivors of these disasters. So we should be part not just of the relief, but of the recovery. So I'm a South Texas girl from the Rio Grande Valley. It's an honor to be able to be here with such an illustrious panel. I want to thank you for the commission and say, this isn't a criticism. I still have some optimism that we can work together to change the world and make this better for the future. So thank you for the opportunity to share my story and for working to build a more responsive and resilient community.
Thank you, Ms. Gorczynski. I appreciate the entire panel. It reminds me that there may be listeners in the public whose family members were harmed or who have lost family members because of Hurricane Harvey. And please know that our thoughts and prayers are with those families and with the friends of those families. The panel will now accept questions from the commissioners. My colleagues, we have a total of 40 minutes, and I trust that you all will raise your hands. I'll recognize you, and you'll use your share of that 40-minute time period. So thanks again to the panel, and who would like to start first?
Excuse me, Commissioner Cantu, I also have testimony.
Oh, excuse me, I apologize. Okay. Please proceed. Excuse me, I jumped ahead. I apologize for calling Ms. Gomez and Ms. Gorczynski, and Ms. Gorczynski, thank you for catching me. I appreciate you. Please proceed.
Thank you, commissioners, for this opportunity to participate on this panel. To let you know, I am Professor of Educational Psychology and Faculty Fellow at the Hazards Risk Reduction Center at Texas A&M University. There, I lead Project RED, Research and Education on Disability and Disaster, which is one of 67 federally funded university centers for excellence in developmental disabilities. Today, I want to offer my perspective as a researcher who focuses on the social, psychological, and policy issues surrounding disasters and disability. In these verbal remarks, I'll highlight three points of interest to the Commission. One, what does research reveal about the experiences of people affected by disaster? Two, why do we see these outcomes? And three, what implications does this research have for improving preparation, recovery, and mitigation, particularly in light of events surrounding Hurricane Harvey? So first, what we see in the research is that people with disabilities are more likely to lose their homes or have property damage. They're more likely to suffer injuries and health-related complications, and they're more likely to lose their lives in disaster. Post-disaster, people with disabilities are more likely to be overlooked by shelter workers, to encounter more barriers to resources, and to receive fewer disaster services. Both adults and children are less likely to receive mental health interventions following disasters. In our own research, we have found recovery from disasters for people with disabilities is more complex, more fraught with barriers, requires additional case management support, and simply lasts longer than does recovery for others. Second, why do disasters differentially impact people with disabilities? Well, what we see prior to disaster is that individuals with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and to be unemployed. In general, they experience poorer levels of health than does the general population, but also face greater barriers to health care. Individuals with disabilities are more likely to live in substandard housing that can place them additionally at risk in disasters. And people with disabilities continue to be marginalized, not only in the US, but in most of the world's societies. And the stigmatization and segregation of people with disabilities affects not only their day-to-day lives, but also the emergency management services and supports that they receive. Note that these factors are in existence before a disaster even occurs. And this research corroborates remarks from Dr. Wachtendorf and then also also Ms. Chapa. So we already know, based on existing research, that people with disabilities are going to be disproportionately impacted even before that first storm raindrop falls. Third, research and reports following Hurricane Harvey on the experiences of individuals with disabilities, together with this existing research that I've just summarized, point to a number of implications. One, during Hurricane Harvey, researchers found neighborhoods with higher proportions of residents with disabilities, particularly people with cognitive and mobility-related disabilities, were more likely to experience Harvey-induced flooding. During Hurricane Harvey, several assisted living facilities were also flooded, directly exposing residents with disabilities to rising waters. Now, infrastructure decisions are under the responsibility of government, whether at local or state or federal levels. So changes in building codes and urban planning can provide better protection for people with disabilities against environmental hazards such as Hurricane Harvey. Two, uncertainties surrounding increasingly irregular weather patterns, such as the unprecedented rainfall that we saw during Hurricane Harvey, require careful consideration. Additional efforts by emergency management are needed to support people with disabilities, given the increasing intensity and unpredictability of these events. For example, a number of states and municipalities have hired disability inclusion specialists to identify barriers for people with disability, to collaborate with FEMA around these issues, and to provide expertise in real time at state operation centers during disasters. However, Texas's Department of Emergency Management did not allocate such a point person to target disability-related issues during Hurricane Harvey. Three, post-disaster, an important objective is to connect survivors to disaster services and resources. However, a study on recovery assistance following Hurricane Harvey revealed that households with individuals with disabilities actually receive less, not more, from governmental and non-governmental organizations. At our Center on Disability and Development, we know that locating disaster resources for people with disabilities can be particularly difficult. So immediately following landfall of Hurricane Harvey, we created a directory of resources for survivors with disabilities, but we also collected data on the type, availability, and number of these resources and how they fluctuated across time. And we found, unfortunately, that disability-related resources in Texas counties began to decrease just 3 months after Hurricane Harvey. And this is especially concerning given research findings that disaster recovery for people with disabilities typically takes much longer. There are 3 other research implications that you can find in my written testimony, but in conclusion, when the social vulnerability of one part of the population is addressed, the resilience of a society as a whole is enhanced. So changes to the design of housing in urban areas, emergency management practice, and disaster-related services can increase the safety of all of us, including people with disabilities. You'll find references to the research I've just discussed again in my written testimony, and thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Stowe, and thank you also for your written submission. Now we will accept questions from our commissioners, our colleagues. Yes, Commissioner Yaki.
Thank you very much, and thank you, panelists, for your statements today. They're very enlightening. There's so many different topics I want to get into, but I'll just go after the low-hanging fruit first. And I'm going to start with Ms. Gomez. As someone who was dealing with a lot of the on-the-ground realities of what was going on, what was your experience with regard to the linguistic and cultural appropriateness of the outreach of the materials of the inspectors who are visiting people's homes, the people who you are representing?
Yeah, so I'm going to use examples from Hurricane Harvey and also some of the recent disasters because they're the same. It hasn't changed. And so a lot of what we've seen as well with regard to individuals who are limited English proficient, it's unfortunate. A lot of the documents are in English or in Spanish. We've experienced cases where initially eligibility determination letters from FEMA, that first round that go out, do typically come in the appropriate language. But when an appeal is submitted specifically regarding other needs assistance, so that division that's administered by the state of Texas, we have seen unfortunate incidents where the form language of the letter is in Spanish, for example, but the actual denial reason is written in English. That's hugely problematic and really inexcusable for a state where one of the second, most populous language is Spanish. And so there are linguistic barriers. We hear clients complain consistently over and over and over again that they cannot get an inspector who speaks their language during the inspection. They tell us that they feel disregarded, that they feel like inspectors refuse to communicate with them. FEMA does have some FEMA inspection guidelines, which are not published to the public, which again is intensely problematic, that tell inspectors that there is a protocol when dealing with someone who may be limited English proficient. And the first step in that is finding someone around them who can translate on their behalf. I don't think that's an adequate way to communicate with an individual. Sometimes that person is 16 years old and is trying to relay construction concepts to an inspector who, as we've been told by clients, often feel like they don't care. They're on a time crunch. They need to move to the next inspection. They're seeing the same problems over and over again. So yeah, language barriers are a huge problem. We try to resolve that at TRLA by providing legal information in multiple languages. But the onus is on the government, and they really need to resolve that problem. It's not an excuse.
Madam Chair, I'll reserve my questions after my colleagues.
Thank you. Wills, please. Yes, Commissioner Adegbile.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Many of your comments, I think there were some themes that emerged in some of the testimony, and many of the comments take as a baseline that there are certain inequities and inequality, socioeconomic and others, some having to do with residential and resources that are available to people. And then when the hurricane comes over on top of this, it sort of acts as an amplifier, and there are cascading effects from people who begin in a situation when they don't have adequate supports in the first place. I'm wondering so that people don't mistake the baseline circumstances to be something that we can't address or that it's something that doesn't require response. If you could help us drill down for a second on what some of the most concerning aspects are of the disparities that you saw along race lines. And we've already heard a bit about disability, but if there's specific additional interventions that you think we should be focused on in that space, that's important. And Commissioner Yaki has already spoken about language access and the like. I'm just trying to think about the various populations who are having difficulty and disparities in the impact. Hurricanes are terrible for everybody, but it does seem that part of your testimony suggests that resources seem to get concentrated to those who have the most rather than to those who have the least. And my point is not that those who have had substantial losses and are of means should not have the help of their government when there's a natural disaster, but equity seems to suggest that we need to think about those who really are on the margins and may not be able to make it through absent some focused attention.
Was that addressed to all the panel or one person in specific?
Whoever wants to take a pass at any piece of it. I know it's a bit of a sprawl, so and any piece of it you want to take up.
Ms. Wachtendorf has her hand up.
Please.
I'll just add a little bit in panelists. I think one thing to clarify with that as well is that it's not only the fact that, so we're looking at compounded impacts. And so when we start thinking about the fact that if we go back to my example, and we've heard it from others about access to the forms and the filing, which is a huge onerous bureaucratic nightmare for everyone who is involved in a post-disaster experience. The consequence of that is detrimental across the board, and it is even more so for those communities that you mentioned. So the fact that if we're looking at not having access to technology or bandwidth, that means you can't go on the computer to upload those. You can't re-upload. It takes time. You miss the deadlines, and there are financial consequences associated with that. If those documents are written in such a way that make it difficult, not only based on language, but based on age, for example, if you're an elderly individual and you have difficulty navigating those documents and not having a caregiver to go through those with you, that will lead to differential consequences and a loss of assistance based on age. So what we're looking for is not, as you mentioned, that it's only attending to one, but the fact that you have these broad-based challenges pre-disaster, lack of infrastructure attention, and without addressing that in communities that is disproportionately the case pre-disaster, those impacts are going to be detrimental for them in the disaster situation.
Thank you. Commissioner
Madam
Yaki?
Chair.
Yes. Commissioner Yaki.
Commissioner
No,
Gilchrist, I think
Ms.
there's another
Gorczynski.
witness with a hand up.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm missing that. Just go ahead and start talking because I don't see you on my screen. I apologize. I've got a full
Madam
gallery.
Chairwoman, it's Veronica.
Hi, please.
Hi. So thank you for the question. The 7 minutes wasn't enough time. So one of the things I want to say is implied is in Houston and in a lot of parts of Texas, we're a majority minority community. We are a community of color. So the disparity happens because overwhelmingly the assistance is in neighborhoods that were either segregated by land use or other reasons, have been underinvested for decades. And so you have this compounding effect in the region. So the area that I represent in East Houston, East Harris County are some of the oldest parts of the community, but I've seen this in other areas such as the Rio Grande Valley. So part of the reason I said I really want us to rethink the delivery of services through a poverty framework is because what that means in Texas, for so many reasons, is that the highest likelihood is that folks that are on SSDI, who are elderly, who live in the family's original home, who have, for a variety of reasons, not been able to keep up to the home, what might be, standards that everybody else would say, oh, you should be able to maintain. For all those reasons, those are the folks that are devastated again and again. We had a terrible freeze that had national news in February. So, part of the challenges, for example, is I do know of homes that potentially haven't had their running water fixed because whatever was already hurt in one storm was affected by another. So when we're thinking about how we offer assistance, you have the challenges that the neighborhoods that are probably the oldest, that have the concentration of older apartment units, older single family homes that haven't been lead abated, that have the highest propensity or density of people who are disabled or elderly that have stayed in original neighborhoods, for example, all those folks are going to be impacted in a disparate way. And they have the least amount of resources. So one of the things that most often I hear as a Houstonian is, why didn't you just leave? Why, you knew it was coming. Why didn't they leave? Why did they stick around? And the answer is very simply, they could not afford to.
Thank you. Thank you. Colleagues?
There's one hand, Madam
Yes,
Chair,
yes.
and Commissioner Gilchrist. Sorry, I'm going to turn it over to you. I just want to make sure the witnesses get to respond. I will yield after Mr. Sanchez has an opportunity to speak to the question.
Not a problem.
Sure, I'll be super brief. I do want to echo Veronica's context and how we need to tackle this problem. Particularly, you talked about, what conditions are there before a disaster. The theme seems to be, let's get people to a new state, to normal. But we're talking disaster after disaster after disaster. And so the state of normal keeps being lesser than it was before in terms of opportunity. And so we're continuing to put people under the framework seems to be, let's get to where we were before the storm. Well, before this storm, they were higher up, and we just keep responding in a very minimalist way. In terms of where we focus these resources, we really need to take and acknowledge that vulnerable communities, those that are impoverished, those that are underserved and we haven't invested, need to be a primary focus of how we recover, because the rest of the community really is dependent on those folks and those communities recovering at full speed. So the entire community can be back up to speed in very simple ways. We've seen a diminishment of disaster recovery centers, and I one of the panelists talked about that earlier in terms of having to drive for an hour. During Hurricane Ike, we had 36 disaster recovery centers. During Hurricane Harvey, and that was for Harris County alone, not the region. You talk about Hurricane Harvey, which was the second costliest storm. We had 16 disaster recovery centers in this region where people had to drive hours or wait in line or were not focused on those communities that needed most. And so we created local recovery centers and took it to those neighborhoods. And we have to be cognizant of those things. We've got, and that it is cumbersome for people to appeal. And on the language issue, as someone that's had to be on the phone with my dad for like the Workforce Commission or something like that is translating, you wait for an hour and a half. By the time you get there, the person on the other line tells you, you can't translate for your father because he didn't sign a piece of paper, even though we're both on the phone. And so these kinds of systems that create hurdles for the most impoverished and those need help are problematic. And also in terms of the question about needing how do we address this between disasters? So many things. When we look at disasters, we can't be making using the framework, how do we get people back to the previous normal before the storm? How do we empower communities to be more resilient to tackle the chronic stressors from transportation to healthcare, food deserts, all those kinds of things that already make recovery more challenging? And I'll close with this. It needs to be more coordinated. DSNAP, disaster, sort of nutritional assistance and food assistance. The vast DSNAP, to get it, you have to wait in line for hours. A through C goes on Monday. D through F goes on Tuesday. Through the rest of the week, they only get one more shot. And when you go to DSNAP, you can't currently be on SNAP, which is fine. But the vast majority of people that are applying for DSNAP are eligible for SNAP for whatever reason they're not doing it. So why aren't we registering folks for SNAP to make them more resilient? We need to talk to each other better among local, state, and federal partners, how we see those opportunities to close those gaps and not let them pass by.
Thank you. Any other panelists wish to address the topic of racial disparities or other vulnerable groups, other vulnerable populations?
Yes, this is Brittany Gomez. I just want to make one really quick comment focusing on a particular legal issue that I think is a massive barrier for low-income families across the state of Texas, not just in our service area, is the home ownership and heirship property issues. This year, FEMA expanded the documentation that it is allowing for individuals to prove alternative home ownership. In Texas, we have very interesting and very complicated real property laws in place. To be clear, those individuals that FEMA has expanded the documentation they will accept for were always homeowners. They have always been homeowners in the eyes of the law of Texas. But heirship properties are just one example of legal issues, real property issues that impact low-income families. Home ownership as a prerequisite, and having to prove that home ownership is a prerequisite to disaster assistance for FEMA or SBA. So that can be problematic. I think that there needs to be a in-depth analysis and maybe even a separate committee that focuses on title issues in the state of Texas that are acting as barriers for low-income individuals. In my written testimony, I provided you a story of a client that I represented for several years, trying to obtain clear title for him to be able to just qualify for FEMA. It was very complicated and arduous, and he was a wonderful client who was a veteran, but he was elderly, and we worked very hard for him. And he ultimately did not get FEMA assistance or SBA assistance going forward. So real property is a barrier impacting people's ability to recover. And, you know, at Trala, we do real property title clearing as disaster preparedness. And so maybe there needs to be some sort of incentive to help encourage that within the communities.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Gilchrist, I'm going to call on you, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And let me thank the panelists for their testimony today. My comment is for Mr. Sanchez. You mentioned in your written testimony that the national flood insurance premiums had to be paid full each year. Is that correct?
It is. It's a couple of issues with the National Flood Insurance Program, and I'll leave others to debate. You know, for example, some places, you know, that don't flood regularly could be $700 a year, it could be $2,000+ a year. I'll leave it for other folks to debate whether those prices are fair or not, if those homes are in an area that is so susceptible to disaster. But it's challenging. If you're paying that, you have to pay that upfront. So we're already looking at, you know, Veronica mentioned the $400 that folks, you know, almost 50% of our community can't come up with for an emergency expense. That was pre-COVID. Imagine where we're at now. So in terms of flood insurance, aside from the disparities, things that you can tackle right now are, why can't you put that on a payment plan for your flood insurance program? Why do you have to pay that up front? Why can't it be built into escrow and things like that? So those are some of the challenges that come sort of with those issues. And those are the kinds of low-hanging fruit, but you're automatically disqualifying, you know, who doesn't take a payment plan? Good, bad, or indifferent, this nation thrives on credit and making monthly payments. Why can't you do that for something that's required, but also build resiliency?
No, thank you for that. And just curious to know, are you aware of any legislative moves that might in any way change that?
I am not. I know there's an active debate, as there is every time the National Flood Insurance Program has to be renewed, where that cost burden should fall. So I know that's still currently the legislative process. I would imagine now or the next time that there's a renewal, that's an opportunity to take a look at that. You know, every few years you have whether or not the Congress will reinstate the National Flood Insurance Programs, and these continuing debates is who should bear the burden of the cost if you're in an area that's prone to flooding. But right now or the next cycle would seem like ideal times to tackle that issue.
Thank you very much.
And I'm trying to check two screens here.
Commissioner Gladney has his hand up.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner Gladney.
Dave, we need
David, you're on mute.
This question is for Mr. Sanchez, Dr. Stowe, anybody else who'd like to answer. But I was wondering if you could list 5 specific areas where you feel FEMA failed to provide Harris County assistance with disabled people prior to or during Harvey.
I'll address this, Francisco, just some broad issues, you know, maybe not FEMA specific, but something I see, you know, across the spectrum. There's a challenge in translation and providing real-time services in terms of being able to have, particularly, for example, deaf and hard of hearing, be able to translations not only in shelters, but also in the recovery process. Those are oftentimes where you need that ability on site in the moment. You know, the appeals process is cumbersome, the application process is cumbersome, having to call back and be on this repeated cycle of trying to mesh someone's availability to do those translations or providing ASL or Spanish language in the moment, just keep sort of extending that process. And I think we also need to take a look at, you know, one of the things that has gotten better, I think is requiring ADA compliance at shelters and those kinds of facilities. I think there's vast improvement for the accommodations that are done there. I think right now it's sort of the minimum. You know, I would urge those folks that are more expert at that than I am, but I think we need to, the ability to not only, and also to provide at the local level, I think there's always challenges, and I think there's always opportunities to improvement in terms of how we provide emergency public information, recovery information, and those kind of critical issues and formats that are accessible to the disability community. We've actually got not to get ahead of myself, we've actually got an exciting announcement coming up next Tuesday of how we're improving some things here sort of in Harris County. But I will tell you, I had the opportunity to sit at the table with some of my colleagues from across the country that are excellent at what they do. But one of the continuing challenges is every time we ask each other, what's working well? Are you doing this as well as you could be? We look at each other and we're like, man, we sure could use some help. So I will say that we need to bring folks to the table with that expertise into these discussions, into that decision making, and building that capacity to have those folks at the table to help guide us through this. One thing that did work well that I think was organic in Harvey, we had a lot of organizations that came up from vulnerable communities, these disadvantaged communities of color, disabled community, disability community, and others that came up and were part of the recovery process that had not been before because of the magnitude of Harvey. We need to welcome them to the table. We need to build capacity, and we need to empower them to be a part of the process. Aside from language, the cultural understanding they bring to be able to translate those services in those communities is essential and something to be valuable to the process.
Dr. Stowe?
Yes, best practice in emergency management is to conduct an after-action report following a disaster. The state of Texas did produce an after-action report called the Eye of the Storm. However, nowhere in the 177 pages of that report was any mention of people with disabilities, of elderly people, or of people with functional needs. And I'll just add this, there were 11 mentions of what to do with animals in disaster. So I do believe it was an oversight of significance there. At that time, or following Hurricane Harvey, there was a disability task force on emergency management. I served on that advisory committee. We produced our own after-action report based on surveys of the disability community and also of our partner disability organizations and service providers that were part of that task force. And we found shortcomings in 4 areas with respect to communication about the impending hazard, Hurricane Harvey, with respect to sheltering, with respect to evacuation, and then also with respect to state and federal resources. And in my testimony, you have a link to both reports. The after action report on individuals with disabilities detail specific recommendation falling under each of these broad areas. So in some, these are very broad areas that we saw shortcomings, need for improvement. And to date, I do not know if the state has followed these recommendations, but what I do know is I know that these are areas we see time and again in disaster that affect people with disability, communication, sheltering, resources, evacuation.
Thank you. And I know this will shock my colleagues, but I only have one more question. And that would be, at the shelters, I understand there weren't facilities for service animals, power dependent people, wheelchair dependent people, autism or IDD folks. And I was wondering if FEMA ever provided instruction or education to Harris County emergency management personnel on caring for persons with disabilities during natural disasters. I guess more specifically, instruction on ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, or civil rights under the Olmstead case. Does anybody know if that's ever happened from FEMA?
I believe at the time, FEMA, prior to Hurricane Harvey, had a training called 197, that's the number of the module, but that had not been updated and not regularly offered to FEMA employees. At the state level, the state of Texas had a Texas form of a 197, and training was offered to emergency managers in the state. However, it is not a required training. It's a supplemental training.
So did that training include civil rights accommodation and how to accommodate for them? And then subsequent to that, Harvey occurred and none of that was really followed? Is that what I'm hearing?
Just for the record, that's part of Commissioner Kaladny's previous last question. Just
there are examples of good provisions for people with disabilities inside of shelters, and there's examples of bad practices. And I would say that those shelters that are run by the American Red Cross are official shelters in the state of Texas, but you also have a lot of pop-up shelters. And in those kind of situations, you have volunteers, you have churches, you have people who may not be very educated about disability-related issues, which does not remove them from the responsibility to make things accessible, but just an explanation for, in part, what occurs there. Now, of course, Hurricane Harvey was not an evacuation disaster, right? For the most part, people sheltered in place because the hurricane originally was going to come in around Corpus Christi. And actually Corpus Christi was really well prepared for evacuation and prepared, but then it went back into the Gulf of Mexico and then came back into Houston. And at that point, evacuating the millions and millions of residents, it was too late to do a full scale evacuation of that type.
Madam Chair, if other commissioners have questions, I defer. If not, I have a follow-up.
Would any of my colleagues have a question? Should I yield to Commissioner Degbele?
Looks like Commissioner Yaki has a question. I yield to Commissioner Yaki.
Thank you. This goes to stuff that a lot of people have touched on, which is sort of how a disaster magnifies pre-existing disparities that may exist within a community. And I'm wondering, in particular, in the recovery effort, FEMA has the ability to allocate what is called hazard mitigation grants. And I would like to know whether they're going in the areas where these affected communities, where these pre-existing disparities exist, number one. Number two, I want to know whether or not you've seen, any of you have seen a pattern where the local buyout and acquisition program is being used disproportionately, and has been reported in several studies to buy out and essentially relocate predominantly minority, particularly African American populations in Harris County.
Just for instance, I'm glad to take a little bit sort of the hazard mitigation grants that come sort of from the federal government and FEMA in particular. So for a percentage of the disaster cost is sort of bundled into mitigation grants that are provided from FEMA, across the state. However, sort of if, for example, Harvey was a Texas disaster, that money for mitigation from the mitigation action grants goes to the state. And then sort of anybody across the state, any jurisdiction can apply for those. So it's not necessarily isolated to that particular community. And then it becomes sort of a competitive process to go and apply for those.
Is that competitive process itself tilted against helping out lower income communities, which is one of the allegations that's been made?
Not sure.
Because of the
Look at it.
matching contribution requirement, et cetera, that communities need to come up with. If you're a poor community and you can't come up with the 10 or 20% that you need to do, it goes to somebody else who can.
Correct, and a large part of that, there's at least two players in that. Is how that money comes down, how they choose to prioritize, who'll get the limited pot of money, what priorities they will do in terms of setting that at the local level. There needs to be that investment in coming up with that match, which for some jurisdictions that are larger and have more resources isn't quite an issue. But you've got folks in communities that may not have the funds to do that, and then you also have to prioritize at the local level. Do we want to tackle that? For example, we were able to use mitigation grant dollars. I can't remember if it was Harvey or not, but to do a piece on mitigation and how people can make their homes more resilient. And we made sure that it was available. We'll be released soon. It's not available only in English, but also in Spanish and also as ASL. So you have those various dynamics going on. Can you afford the match? Do you have the resources locally to compete for those? And also, are you prioritizing at the local level to make sure to tackle those issues of inequities?
Well, let me just do a quick follow-up on that, because going to a point that I think Ms. Gomez made and others have made about the fact that FEMA does a lot with homes, but not as much with renters. To what extent can these grant funds be used to rehabilitate and stabilize rental housing rather than just ownership housing, so that people aren't having to be relocated or move or whatever has happened to a lot of different communities, rental communities especially, post disaster?
Yeah, so a couple of observations on that. One is you've got these various players at the federal level, from HUD that deals with housing to FEMA dollars and some other agencies. So I will tell you on the rental side, you do have a disparity in that FEMA provides individual assistance, direct money grants that don't have to be repaid to homeowners. And then an option for renters is SBA, which provides low interest loans. And so you're putting renters in a capacity where they have to get a loan. They're owners of a property, receive money that doesn't have to be paid back. So I think exploring those kinds of issues and what inequities lie there, is certainly its value. And then I will tell you, in terms of the monies that are available, one of the things that's challenging is that every round of dollars tends to come with different sets of requirements and standards. And so our hope is that those evolve for the better. But every round of mitigation dollars, whether from any number of federal agencies, has to be managed in accordance with those latest rules are. And sometimes they're better, sometimes they're not. But I think baking in the kind of framework that prioritizes diversity, equity, inclusion, and recognizing that we need to move these vulnerable communities as the focus for recovery, and not bringing them back to normal, but bringing them to a state of resilience, really ought to be the priority.
Thank you. Veronica?
Thank you. As an observer and a former program officer, we've been working on the apartment complex and the multifamily question for, in my experience, over a decade, and we haven't gotten it right. And that's going to need more research, specifically because renters are placed at a disadvantage, and we don't accommodate for what happens when whole apartment complexes are unlivable. We struggle with that. And it's everything from let's get them temporary assistance to what's the baseline of sanitary and safe, how long can we let them stay in there? And the result is we still have stories. I think that I saw one in the news last week that was talking about mold in apartment complexes and whether or not their project-placed voucher could be moved and portable. And I know Brittany will have more about that piece. So I would urge more research and partnership on how we do this differently, because the number is increasing. When I worked on the initial plan from the state of Texas and I was on a team to HUD, the request was $3 billion for the state of Texas. In Harvey, I don't remember what the total was. I know someone on the panel, I think it was 7. I know for Harris County, it was $1 billion, and the city of Houston is $1 billion. From that, I can't tell you how much went to hazard mitigation or how much is going into apartment complexes, because there's a difference between, can we rehab what's there? Do we build something new in a new place? And when you build something new, it's an additional 3 years to kind of get that in the unit from award and getting the ground done. So this is I think you hit on a key issue. It's very complex. I definitely would encourage more research on this. And then I'll defer to Brittany. You've been so patient, but I know you've been on the ground working on this issue for years too.
Yeah, I want to hear from Brittany too. I mean, one of the things that I encountered when we were dealing with the Loma Prieta earthquake was that FEMA still had a vision of America as 1950s single-family homes with white picket fences, and it's making me think that they still haven't quite deviated from that model yet. So, Brittany, you could just answer your hand up, and then I'll defer back to Commissioner Degbele.
Yes, of course. So I believe the allocation of funding was around $5 billion for areas. And I think that excludes potentially Harris County. Their allocation was slightly different, but you're right. Ideally, I would love to see mitigation funding, at least from Hurricane Harvey, be reallocated towards a direct renter program, since they were excluded completely from the initial allocation of CDBGDR funding. Programs that renters would benefit from that homeowners currently get under the homeowners assistance program as additional rental assistance, utility assistance, transportation assistance, appliance reimbursement, and security deposit assistance for when they are temporarily displaced. All of those things are things renters also need and can benefit from. The funding for CDBGDR was allocated for the affordable rental program, which I touched on briefly in my opening statement, and not towards direct housing assistance if mitigation funding could be used to address that issue. But the affordable rental program's maximum rent policy allows renters to charge up to 30% of 65% of the average median of the area median income. And that's according to GLO's own housing guidelines, which HUD had approved for this disaster. Generally, HUD public housing requirements limit the maximum rent of a low-income individual to 30% of their income. Ultimately, in the broad scope, what this means is extremely low-income and very low-income individuals will be excluded from the affordable rental program because they won't be able to afford the maximum rent or afford to rent those places. Additionally, one example that just comes to me off the top of my head, and this may have changed more recently, but if I can remember correctly, only one apartment complex is being built in Corpus Christi, Texas. It is of 25 units. And like I mentioned, extremely low income and very low income individuals won't qualify for that. And then one way you could very easily make this requirement accessible to renters who are impacted by Hurricane Harvey is by putting a requirement that some of those units be capped at the 30% of their income, as well as giving preference to Hurricane Harvey survivors, since the money was intended to repair damage from Hurricane Harvey.
Thank you. Commissioner Deblay, is this a question that can go to the next panel? Oh, Commissioner Gilchrist hasn't. Is this something they're going to wait to the next panel, or do you need to do it now?
They're actually on some of what we've heard.
Okay, follow-up questions? Do I have consent from the commissioners to keep the panel a little longer? Hearing no objection, you've only got 5 more minutes, folks, because we do have a hard close on this.
So I just wanted to understand 2 things about the testimony we've heard. We've heard a little bit about a CDBG exclusion for renters, and I want to know if anybody has an understanding about what the rationale would be for that in light of the inequities that seem to flow from it. And then with respect to the after action reports that were described, I'm trying to understand if any of those reports speak to the demographic inequities that you all have been identifying. Is there ever a recognition and a coming to terms with those experiences, some of which you've been talking about today? If not, why not?
I hear a panelist wanting to respond.
So I think, sorry, this is Brittany Gomez again. I think one issue regarding why renters have been excluded may actually come down to the numbers. If you look at some of the data that GLO used and cited in its state action plan, which was subsequently approved by HUD, there might be an indication that the homeowner's unmet need is substantially larger than that of a renter's unmet need after Hurricane Harvey. There's some question as to where or how that number was calculated. In the GLO state action plan, it does indicate that they may have not excluded insurance when calculating the number of the total number of unmet need. I'm looking for the statistic here. So So currently, the state action plan indicates that $6.9 billion of unmet housing need for homeowners. But if you would exclude insurance from that, that actually would result in an unmet need of $2 billion. Whereas if you did the same thing for renters, which was allocated for $2.7 billion, excluding insurance from that, it's 2.6. That's a large discrepancy. And so I think it comes down to data. I think there's also a conciliation agreement in which HUD and the state of Texas came to after Ike and Dolly regarding the same thing. And the conciliation agreement ultimately determined that direct financial assistance for renters was necessary.
Dr. on the after action piece.
Yes, and I got to say, I'm continually befuddled. I mean, I look at these after action reports, I look for recommendations towards people with disabilities or functional and access needs, and I'm continually surprised, frankly. What I can say is that populations with disabilities have come late to the discussion about civil rights behind people of color or people who don't speak English as a first language. And this is another instance in which paying attention to the experiences of people with disabilities is overlooked again. So I don't have a good answer. All I can do is more research.
Do those reports speak about racial inequities?
The one that I'm referencing, the eye of the storm, I'd have to go back and look at that. Nothing about seniors, nothing about people with mobility impairments or hearing impairments. I'd have to go back through that. You have a link to it in my report.
Thank you.
Commissioner Gilchrist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This comment is for Ms. Veronica. I was most intrigued by reading your testimony that you wanted to see more collaboration with additional groups, participate with FEMA. Why do you feel like that's not happened to any large degree?
I think Francisco touched on it a little bit in that they weren't a part of the process previously because the government came in and handled it. But what I saw differently in this storm was in the community we serve, the Hispanic, Spanish-speaking churches became shelters. That's where people had confidence to go and ask for help, whatever the help was. We also saw a lot more on social media. And so what I was trying to say is that these storms are getting bigger. The process and the bureaucracy of government, by just the premise that we're here, it's not working and delivering. And so asking for groups that understand the neighborhood, that have cultural competency, that have local knowledge, that can understand how we approach even people for assistance. There are neighborhoods, and everyone here knows a neighborhood, I would argue, that you could not knock on the door and say, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
No, thank you for that. Just give me an example of what type of groups you are referring to.
So there's always, there's challenges with the faith-based community. A lot of smaller churches really stepped it up and didn't ask. They asked for donations, they didn't ask for reimbursement. On the next panel, you have a wonderful woman named Kathy Flanagan-Payton who's going to give you her story and what she's done. And she has done things outside of the box. She's a community resource organization. that maybe might help in the long-term recovery, but started doing more to help pre-position resources as the storm was coming in. We have a large number of community development corporations that maybe haven't helped on the front end piece. I saw interesting innovations among school districts, and I don't know how school districts, because I've not had that benefit, interact with FEMA or HUD, but were they in areas where shelters couldn't be set up, were setting up the spaces there beyond the Red Cross requirements. They were having people come volunteer, and they were asking for donations. So the smaller organizations that are embedded in the community, and here are some key things to consider. They're not going to be able to loan you money and ask to be reimbursed. They just don't have it. But they know the people in the neighborhood, they're asking for the donations and they're coalescing their resources. And you could do that across pocket neighborhoods all across Houston. I would probably argue in other cities in the country too. So I don't have a perfect definition for you, Commissioner, but I think where people haven't been there before, they need to be invited to participate, and they need to give you the recommendations on the solutions on how they can help you. And then government will tell us, from a bureaucracy perspective, where we're not going to duplicate benefits or allow for them to participate.
No, thank you very much for that. And I guess one of the consistent themes I've heard throughout your testimonies today is accessibility, making sure that whatever we have in place, it's accessible to the people we're trying to serve. And so that's kind of what I was getting at. Thank you so much for those comments. I appreciate that.
Sure. And sir, if I may, part of the reason I really hammer on it is I have seen for years, people in my community do not ask for help or assistance. They're going to figure it out themselves. They're going to figure it out with their family, and they're just going to get it done because that's all we're able to do in their eyes. And so when I know that we can do better, it's because when I've knocked on the door, or I've had friends I know knock on the door, and they know that we're from the neighborhood or that I'm affiliated with the parish, we get other results and we're able to help in a different way. And the problem is now getting too big beyond us to just have the one discussion on, what do we do with FEMA? It's going to have to be these community-oriented solutions, and they're going to be difficult. They're not going to be easy. But in my personal experience, when we have to find out how we're going to help, Mrs. Smith down the street, those are the folks that help me get it done.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner Gilchrist. Well, I can see why this panel had a difficult time getting off the stage, because you are so well prepared and you're so informative. So I really appreciate you very much. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come on back at 38 minutes after the hour. Oh no, 48 minutes after the hour. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. And thank you very much, first panel. You did terrific.